The most recent episode of your show tackles the very idea of freedom and democracy in the United States and worldwide. You had these activists on your show from Egypt and Venezuela and the Philippines to talk about the guardrails of democracy. And one of the things you asked them was if they think that Americans who are worried about the erosion of democracy, whether we are, you, me, others, are hyperventilating too much.
Mhm.
What do you think, and were you reassured at all by what they had to say?
Well, to some extent, I was. I mean, I think in general, Americans have a view of the country similar to that, the sort of classic New Yorker poster of New York City versus the rest of the country. So it's bracing sometimes to hear the reality of people's lives in other countries. As it's not to say that warning signs don't exist or bells aren't going off, or that democracy is a birthright and is something that will always be with us as a kind of a sash that we wear, having been crowned the greatest democracy. But it did remind us that we have a long way to go before we end up in those situations. And it's kind of like, watching a fable where you realize, like, maybe the end of a Christmas Story, where you're like, what day is it? It's Christmas Day. Oh my God, that's great. I still have time. Like, we still have time. But I think we see now that, unfortunately, the messiness of democracy is oftentimes maybe one of its greatest weak points, in that we talk about protecting it in a way. I remember it was always, the hyperventilating over, Donald Trump is not normal. He's violating the Hatch Act. And the most part, people at home would be like, I don't know what hatch you speak of. People generally want prosperity and security. And if a democratic system is having difficulty providing that, or if it's being subverted by those who want to create chaos so that they can, make a more authoritarian government, that's part of it too. Listen, it's nothing's guaranteed like that. And the encouraging thing is watching on a grassroots level people that are really viewing it as something that they want to protect and that they want to strengthen, and working on those things on the ground.
As somebody who worries about democracy every day, I do appreciate your conveying of optimism right now. But we have a majority of the Republican voters out there who think that falsely that the election was stolen, and who think it is an integral part of defining themselves as a Republican to say that Donald Trump had the election stolen from him. I mean, this is not only not going away, this misinformation, big lie, flirtation with autocracy, it's getting worse, I think.
That's the worst bedtime story I've ever heard. You can fret about it, or you can go about strengthening those areas. And I think that's the call to action here is, action is the antithesis of anxiety. So if we've identified the pressure points where the guardrails look most vulnerable, that's where we should be focusing so much of our efforts in terms of strengthening. We're adjusting to a new information and political ecosystem, and it's gonna be rocky.
It felt like there used to be a sense of shame that existed, at least to a degree, about these sorts of mistruths or lies or disinformation. And maybe I'm being naive. Maybe I'm being nostalgic.
You are being naive, Tapper. That's what I'm saying.
But
you're being naive.
But maybe I am. Maybe I am. But it did feel like there was a time where, if somebody's rhetoric, like Donald Trump's rhetoric, going after journalists or Democratic politicians or whatever, created somebody who actually was literally sending pipe bombs to news organizations, to politicians, that would create a sense of shame and responsibility, and that politician would tone it down. And we're like way beyond that. Nobody cares anymore. There's no incentive structure that's built for, other than if shame doesn't exist. Yeah.
But the consequence is loss of power. It's always been that way. Violence is part of our national heritage. I mean, we had a civil war, for God's sakes.
Right.
And when the rhetoric gets to a certain point and the other side has been treated like enemies of the state, well, then it makes sense. My point is only that I don't think that dynamic is different. It's that the delivery system is more sophisticated, more robust, and more ubiquitous. And so the virulence of it kind of helps radicalize in maybe a faster way or a deeper way. I mean, we have algorithms that make sure that if you're starting to lean towards something bad, that you have to go, like, everybody just dips their toe into radicalism, and then the algorithm says, ooh, you like that video?
Right.
I've got a 4-hour manifesto you've got to see.
Right.
Like, we've created a machine that makes that kind of radicalization more efficient.
And you were talking a second ago about identifying the weak points in the guardrails of democracy. It's also obvious, and I know you've spoken about this in the past, that Donald Trump has also identified those weak points. He is now endorsing candidates for Secretary of State in battleground states, candidates who are all in on the big lie in Arizona.
I think we make a mistake focusing this all on Donald Trump as though he's, I don't know, Magneto and some incredible supervillain that has changed the very nature and temperature of the United States. Like, he's just been an effective vessel. But again, like, he's not singing new songs. This is something, he's maybe singing them a little better than, Goldwater. But I think it's a mistake to focus it all on this one individual, and not to focus it more on, the idea that power is its own reward, whether it be in the financial industry or in government. Like, power doesn't seed itself. And unless we can figure out a better way to balance that power for, for workers and voters and different groups, we'll be vulnerable. I don't know that autocracy is purely the domain of Donald Trump. I think that we all have a bit of a tendency to be like, to grant amnesty to people that are doing things that we would prefer, even if that means that they're slightly undemocratic. There's many times where I think to myself, like, just do an executive order, for God's sakes, just get it done. So I think our focus unhealthily on this one individual comes at the price of systems and dynamics that have been in place long before this cat ever learned how to surf those waves.
I think that what's going on is, it turns out, and we've learned a lot of this in recent decades, but especially maybe the last 4 or 5 years, because Donald Trump was so disruptive and so willing to challenge norms, we've learned that a lot of the American system is built on the honor system. And that only works, of course, if you care about or even have a sense of honor. And I know that you're not so much concerned about an autocracy taking root as you are in the minority party figuring out how to rule, despite the fact that they do not enjoy majority support.
I think there's always been the danger that a minority of voices would have a majority of power. I mean, in a lot of ways, that's baked into the way that the system was created and enacted. And I just think in general, coming up with remedies to that have proven to be really difficult, because the larger issues is, we've elevated money and corporate power to this one level. We've diminished sort of pure democratic power to another level, and we're wildly out of balance. That's an awfully Oprah-esque way of putting the threat to the republic. But Jake, we're irregular. I think we're irregular right now. We need democratic fiber to help ourselves.
So But that's not to say that you are not worried about what's going to happen in 2024.
I'm worried about everything.
Right.
I'm constant. Of course. I'm a human being. I try to maintain a certain level of optimism, which I do, I think. But yeah, when you can see a train coming at you this far away, yeah, you keep thinking, are we gonna put, so are we putting a thing up, or we're just gonna let it, it's gonna come, just gonna hit, that's gonna be the end of it? But boy, power doesn't ever cede itself, and it's a difficult thing to balance.
बाल तेरे सिल्की सिल्की हाँ बातें कर दिल की हाँ बाल तेरे सिल्की सिल्की हाँ बातें कर दिल की हाँ इतनी सोहनी हंसी है तेरी आय हाय इतनी सोहनी हंसी है तेरी करे मुझे किल में हाँ करे मुझे किल में हाँ hey girl चल संग महंगे वाले होटल में चल संग महंगे वाले होटल में फिकर कर तू बिल की ना बाल तेरे सिल्की हाँ बातें कर दिल की हाँ बाल तेरे सिल्की हाँ बातें कर दिल की हाँ बातें कर दिल की हाँ नजर ये मेरी जब तुझ पे पड़ी कुछ तो